All right, well, good afternoon. I believe we'll go ahead and get started. My name is John Kenyon. I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature Organization, and I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion. We are pleased that we could consider this to be part of the Iowa City Book Festival, which is going on this week, that we are running here. And this has become a tradition for us that the Friday IWP panel that coincides with the book festival becomes part of our festival, and it's a wonderful partnership that we've had over the years. I did want to bring your attention to the full schedule of things that's going on at the book festival. They are over here for those who are in the room, and you can find out more for those watching online at iowocitybookfestival.org. So I would like to thank our sponsors for the festival. The City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, and Iowa Public Radio are sponsoring this year's festival. And of course, we thank our partners with the Iowa City Public Library, who so graciously host many of our events throughout the course of the week. One of our programming partners, as I mentioned at the outset, that we have had for many years is the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. And we have been able to do a number of programs over past book festivals in conjunction with the IWP, including an earlier event this week that featured one of our panelists and our guest, Pierre Joris, who is here joining us again today. So welcome. Today we have a panel discussion that features four of the residents with the International Writing Program this year. And to tell you more about them and the topic that they will be discussing, I would like to introduce Christopher Merrill, who is the director of the IWP. So, Chris.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everybody. The title of our panel today, Reality Hunger, has as a tagline, "Are content consumers even more reality hungry, greedy for some new currency of truthfulness?" And to introduce that, I wanted to read you some words from the Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski, what he said in an interview in 1992. He said, "It is very difficult to write now because the end of our century is marked by a tremendous acceleration of the historical process. Literature hates this. The writer needs a certain quietness and evenness of perspective, a space of time for reflection. There is no distance now. There are some changes that we can watch on the television, but there are certain very profound, important transformations which we do not have the opportunity to see. Fiction writers avoid this by writing about marriage, love, things like that. They will not touch the volcano the world has become." This was, mind you, in the middle of the wars of succession in the former Yugoslavia during the siege of Sarajevo. If you try to touch it, to describe it, you find that it requires a new imagination. The problem is not so much with the writing itself as with the creative imagination. The acceleration of history proves that we have a very limited imaginary capacity. We never dreamed the world would become such a rich and various place. And remember, this was basically before the internet, before Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and on and on and on. The world is changing around us, and shall I add, the pandemic, which is why so many of you are watching this from home. Our four distinguished panelists today are going to work in their customary way. They'll read a statement, Prix, then we'll open it up to questions. John Kenyon will have the microphone. Please make sure you speak into the microphone so that the listeners at home, the viewers at home, can hear the question. And finally, to note that if you want more information about the International Writing Program, about the writers on this panel, about our upcoming schedule, samples of their work, and these panels, please go to iwp.uiowa.edu. Our writers are in order. Sanam Maher is a nonfiction writer and journalist from Pakistan whose stories have tended to focus on Pakistan's art and culture, business, politics, religious minorities, and women. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, The Caravan, Roads and Kingdoms, and the Times Literary Supplement, among many others. Her first book, A Woman Like Her, The Short Life of Kandil Balak, an investigation into the murder of Pakistan's first social media celebrity, appeared in 2018. She participates in the fall residency of the International Writing Program, courtesy of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. She will be followed by Fahri Oz, who's a poet, scholar, and translator from Turkey. He has translated into Turkish many British and American 19th and 20th century poets, and is currently bringing into Turkish Walt Whitman's and Emily Dickinson's collected works. He's the co-editor of a collection of sudden fictions, Life is Short, Proust is Long, and the author of the poetry volume, Heavily Overcast 15 Degrees Celsius with Zero Chance of Rain. Until 2017, when he was dismissed for signing the Academics for Peace Declaration, he taught at Ankara University, and his participation is sponsored by the Institute for International Education and the University of Iowa, and private gifts this fall. Our third writer, Kim Hana, is a fiction writer from South Korea. She studied Korean language and literature at the University of Cheongju. Her first novel, Jerry, was the 2010 winner of the Today's Author Prize. The second novel, Junk, was longlisted for the 2013 Dongan Prize of Literature, and a subsequent novel, The Gold Star Telephone, received the 2016 Surin Prize for Literature. She's also published a book of essays on yoga, What Makes Me Breathe, and she participates in the IWP courtesy of the Arts Council Korea. Our final speaker, who read here on Wednesday night, Habib TENGOUR, is a poet, essayist, playwright, translator, scholar, and editor from Algeria, who has published over 20 volumes, most recently the poetry volume, Empecades Sandals. Got it wrong yet again. His poetry has been translated into English, German, Italian, Arabic, and many other languages, and in turn, he translates poetry from Arabic and English. His participation in the fall residency has been made possible by a grant from the Paul and Hualing Engle Memorial Fund. Please join our writers, and we'll begin with Sanam.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for being here today, and to Janvi for editing these for us. Being true to a story. In the 14 years of being a journalist, only twice have I tried to tell the complete story of someone's life. In both instances, my subjects were women. I had known the first one my whole life, my mother, and never met or interacted with the second. My work on them was linked intrinsically and would inform my approach to telling a real story, even though I didn't know it at the time. In July 2016, I was commissioned to write about my mother. She had 5 daughters and was the first woman in Pakistan to become a maxillofacial surgeon, the first in her family to pursue an education and career to the extent of leaving her home country to study and work abroad. She did it all while struggling with addiction and mental illness. I wrote the piece with her permission and interviewed her several times. I joked that I hardly needed to do that because I had been doing in-depth research for this piece for 30-something years. But the truth is, the details eluded me. In small acts of self-preservation over the years, I had erased much of the record of who she had been and all that she had done, and now I could not rely on her to be a reliable narrator of that record to help me piece it together. Our conversations felt rushed. There was so much I needed to know. It felt like the first time we were meeting as adult women. But this was only a brief period of clarity for her, and she relapsed soon after. The resulting piece was not just about the stigma of mental illness and addiction in a conservative culture, but also an elegy. The person I had known and loved was gone. A stranger had taken her place, and that felt like the most real, undeniable fact, the only thing I could write about with certainty. My first lesson in creating a record. The missing pieces, the erasures, are all crucial parts of the story if you let them be. That story did well enough to catch the attention of editors who offered me a book deal. 10 days later, a young social media celebrity named Kandil Baloch was killed. She was a rebel, the first in her family to live, work, and earn the way that she did. leaving a village in southern Punjab and becoming a household name across Pakistan. We were consuming every photograph and video of her, and we thought we knew her. As it turned out, her real name was not even Kandil, and she had hidden almost all the details of her life while managing to become one of the most well-known faces in the country. I immediately knew I wanted to work on her story. Over the coming months, I hoarded information about her, meeting anyone that had even the briefest interaction with her, poring over her videos, tweets, pictures, and diary entries. It took me some time to realize that the story I wanted to tell was not the real story of Kandil, but that of her audience, those who were fascinated with her but took pleasure in her brutal erasure. The curated persona that had held us in its gaze was as important as any biographical details I had scavenged. I am a reporter, and it is my job to find the truth in any story, in any situation, any place. Let's think of the facts that reporters have told you, an American audience, about the place I come from and the people that I know. It's a poor, chaotic country of more than 200 million, led by a craggly, handsome former cricket star and playboy-turned-politician. After September 11, 2001, we were a hornet's nest, the ally from hell, the most dangerous nation in the world. My home city of Karachi is more likely to be the subject of a travel advisory than a guide. In 1947, the New York Times scoffed that all of Karachi looks like the wrong side of the railroad tracks. And by 2012, Time branded the city Pakistan's dark heart, dangerous, chaotic, ungovernable. Somehow we get by. In the time of social media, I believe everyone can tell their own story. As we learn about narratives that have been pushed to the margins, erased, or falsified, and are in the process of rewriting our own histories, we must ask ourselves whether it is more important to promise the whole truth and nothing but, or to acknowledge our limitations and to try and write what means something to us. The pretense of objectivity has been abandoned. We are part of the stories we tell. Why pretend otherwise? Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me here. I was going to, title the text of my speech, Tell the Truth, but Tell it slant, quoting from Emily Dickinson, but I forgot. So here we go, truth, but nothing but the truth. The history of literature teems with examples of the rift between fact and pure imagination. Let's remember, Plato, who banished poets from his republic on grounds that they distort facts and deviate from ideals of the republic. Since they corrupt youth by inciting their passions rather than encouraging their fruits of reason, Plato believed poets should be driven away. They could come back on condition that they prove their usefulness for the republic. So for Plato, the production of delight by means of imagination did not suffice. And poetry, therefore, should have some pragmatic use, or ideological, maybe in that sense. In short, from a pragmatic viewpoint, poetry and literature, in general, is a wild horse that can be dangerous for its rider and other people. Therefore, it must be tamed, penned up, and treated with caution. But such caution does not solve the problem. Imagination and facts are like a seesaw where, equilibrium is rather difficult to maintain. It is difficult to determine where imagination ends and facts begin. So let's attempt to define them. This is a very simplistic definition I came up with. By facts or truth, I mean statements whose validity does not depend on personal perceptions and impressions. Imagination, on the other hand, is based on my impressions and perceptions. To illustrate this point, let's take the case of the novel, My Struggle, by the Norwegian novelist Karl Ove Knausgaard. This work, introduced as a novel in Turkey, was in fact a fictionalized autobiography. Some prefer the term autofiction. Knausgaard revealed a lot about his personal and private life, as well as some delicate family secrets. The book was a big hit, but it was cursed by Knausgaard's offended relatives, since some of their dirty linen was exhibited to the public. For some poets, personal experience and facts play a major role in their writing. The turn-of-the-century poet Thomas Hardy wrote heartbreaking lyrics about his late wife. In the 1960s and 70s, Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, and Anne Sexton went bolder into the poetic sea and wrote about their psychological experiences verging on nervous breakdown. The use of truthiness comes probably most strikingly to the fore in what we call war poetry. The World War I poet Wilfred Owen is one of the most straightforward in dealing with atrocities of the trench warfare and chemical warfare. The Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet wrote abundant lyrics about his own experiences in prisons, about his lovers, his wives, his friends. He wrote about his country he was banished from, or that banished him. I quote, "I love my country. I've swung on its plane trees. I've slept in its prisons. Nothing lifts my spirit like its song and tobacco." Nazım was a legendary poet, and this legend was woven out of his tragic and beautiful life, or tragically beautiful and beautifully tragic life. Like Walt Whitman, with whom he shares a deep love for his country and its people, he did not need a mask. In Nazım's poetry, the speaker and the poet, the lyric voice and the author overlap. The poem is no mere artifact, but almost an organic outgrowth of the poet himself. Okay, my poems are based on my personal experiences, my dreams, and visions. However, I treat my experiences in such a way that they could become experiences for anybody. My poems do not simply reveal my inner world. I use my personal experiences as a means to talk about similar situations or about what they might signify for readers of my poems. I must confess, though, I am still at a loss as to what extent my personal experiences and real people I know should, enter my poems. One of my poems made use of a figure, a cloth merchant from my village, without mentioning his name. When my book of poems appeared, my sister called and congratulated me, and she added that she liked the poem that dealt with this cloth merchant from our village. In the poem, I imagine him driving his old blue truck to the town where he used to sell fabrics. This is a reference that only those who knew this man could figure out. For others who don't know him, the poem is simply about a man driving his truck. This brings us to the issue of what literature is, and in particular what poetry is. While fiction is expected to provide a setting for narrative, I mean names, places, dates, motives, etc., poetry is not. The readers of poetry are invited and encouraged to imagine particular images, feelings, experiences, and situations. As Jean Cocteau says, "I am a lie that always tells the truth." Okay, thank you.
Hi, it's Hannah. First of all, I'm not perfect at speaking English, but I'll do my best. Please understand me well. The mirror that reflects myself and the dressing of the tail. When I was young, I was cross-eyed, a result of meningitis. For me, I have got surgery to correct my eyes when I was 14, so now I'm totally fine. In South Korea, many people tend to judge others by their appearance. I was bullied by students at school. They called me a skinty pig. I did not like going to school or studying. I liked spending time reading books alone in my own space because I did not have any friends. At that time, I read anything I found: history, comics, science books. Storybooks were my favorite because the characters in the novels were like me. They were depressed, alone after being bullied, or discriminated against in their society. As I read them, I did not think I was alone and believed that there were people living in the same way as me in this world, with the same feelings. Novels were like a mirror for me. they reflected my inner side, not my outer appearance. Despite the characters being of a different gender, race, generation, or occupation, every time I read their stories, I resonated with their feelings and the isolation, difficulties, and concerns they faced. For instance, when I read the novel The Castle by Franz Kafka, the protagonist K was definitely different from me. He is a man and a land surveyor, a character who lives in a different world, environment, and area from me. However, the loneliness and emotions he felt while living in a strange village was similar to my experiences in school in childhood. Franz Kafka created narratives using fantasy and allegory rather than reality. As everyone knows, his novella, The Metamorphosis, is about the protagonist Gregor Samsa, who wakes up one morning to find himself inexplicably transformed into an enormous insect. That story is not grounded in reality. It is just an imagination. However, how his family and co-workers deal with Gregor Samsa greatly resembles our reality. Many literary critics argue that Kafka named the character Samsa after himself. The spelling of Kafka and that of Samsa have the same vowel and consonant arrangements. We could see that Franz Kafka was revealing his own reality through the character of Samsa. In those ways, novelists seek reality by inflexibly revealing themselves in fiction. They tend to begin the pursuit of reality with their innermost sheer line. A tale is like a piece of clothing, where a novelist can hide and reveal herself at the same time. As if the tale was a kind of a dress, I think novelists eventually write their own intimate stories in the various narratives, producing reality through fiction. Therefore, the only thing that makes the novel realistic is themselves, and novelists never refuse to travel to their enormous sheer line. I'm not different from these novelists and tend to see myself both as a narrator and protagonist in my work. The main characters in my stories are usually novelists and yoga instructors, just like the protagonist Garth in the novel The World According to Garth by John Irving is a wrestler, just like accurately the author. Plus, I prefer to describe my reality of living as an artist and a part-time instructor through novels. I do not want to create the characters of my novel as celebrities, doctors, or astronauts just to attract attention. Of course, I can show the fancy and fantastic world that most ordinary people have never experienced, but I can't find my feelings and my inner self in those stories. As I have mentioned before, that story would not be a mirror to look within. Therefore, I don't hesitate to present myself as a character in my work because I like to share my inner feelings with people, and the readers are able to discover the reality they have experienced through that character. The best way for novel to pursue reality is through the writer who looks deep inside herself and reveals what she finds. Deep within yourself, you should know there is latent truth and magnificent power of the universe, more than you can ever imagine. Even if ordinary people hesitate to look at it or express it, it is a writer's job to be vulnerable in looking inward and describe it accurately. It will be both the reality of the novelist and the reality of all of us. When that happens, we may be able to experience the miracle that my story becomes our story. Thank you.
I apologize because my English is not fluent and I have a chance to have my translator, Pierre Joris, here. I read my text in French and he read it in English because I feel it better. La poésie est le réel absolu. Plus une chose est poétique, plus elle est vraie. Ces mots de Novalis que j'avais placés en exergue au vieux de la montagne indiquaient nettement ma démarche poétique, me définissant comme poète et assignant à la poésie le dévoilement du réel. Le poète est celui qui va être attentif aux mots, au mouvement de la phrase, au dévoilement des choses par la langue. L'écriture poétique est une exigence par rapport à la langue dont elle cherche à explorer toutes les possibilités par la simple sonorité des résonances. Elle articule la langue avec le corps de celui qui écrit pour que les mots surgissent dans leur justesse et leur précision. La poésie reste un travail sur soi et sur le réel. Elle le fonde, et c'est pourquoi elle est le réel. Le réel est une multiplicité de langages. Ce que le poète traduit, c'est le mode d'appréhension du réel, souvent un bégaiement. Pour ce qui concerne la traduction, le fragment permet de saisir le réel dans son instantanéité. Or, le réel ne se perçoit que par instantané. Ce sont des bribes que le poète travaille et organise de façon à produire quelque chose, autre chose, qui n'est pas la réalité advenue, mais en devenir. La façon dont ces fragments du réel sont intriqués donne une autre réalité. Cette réalité n'est jamais produite totalement. Chaque fois, ces fragments, pour celui qui va les lire, peuvent produire des réalités différentes parce que les mots, en fonction de l'accent mis sur elles ou telle séquence de la phrase, vont produire autre chose. Ce n'est pas le réel reconstruit que l'on va théoriser. La poésie permet de démonter, d'exhiber les rouages de cette construction. Tout le travail d'écriture poétique est une affaire de déconstruction, reconstruction de la structure linguistique. Ça doit être là, sans pour autant s'imposer au texte. Une reconstruction que le roman classique exigeait au nom d'une continuité fictive. Le réel n'est jamais donné dans l'écriture, mais plutôt sa discontinuité. Sa perception n'est que fragmentaire. La saisie du réel par le poème est une affaire de confrontation, de collage, de montage, de rencontre d'images ou d'objets qui ne sont pas faits pour se rencontrer, qui vont animer le poème et amener à s'interroger sur ce que l'on voit dans le réel. Ce n'est pas la réalité objective, mais son ordonnancement dû au hasard de la sélection. Le réel peut être lu de mille et une façons. Aussi, le poète est-il attentif à enregistrer tous les faits qu'il voit. Son œil va les enregistrer, son esprit va les interroger autrement. Les heures qui en découlent vont produire des illuminations. Mon écriture, parce qu'elle interroge le réel, renvoie le dogmatisme au néant. Oser entrer dans le mythe pour le casser s'il est pétrifié ou le réorienter s'il est encore vivant. L'intégrisme religieux ne veut pas d'une telle démarche. L'intégrisme est dans l'affirmation de la vérité. Sa vision est inébranlable. Or, toute vision est là pour être ébranlée. L'écriture poétique est perception mouvante du réel. Elle est justement cette instabilité tranquille. L'instabilité n'est pas non-stabilité. Elle est, au contraire, très ancrée dans le mouvement. Le poème n'offre jamais une vérité, mais ouvre des possibilités. Il n'offre jamais une image totalement cadrée, accomplie, mais des fils permettant de reconsidérer l'image que le poète perçoit et veut donner à voir dans sa propre langue. Ces fils permettent, selon les moments, selon la façon dont on les reprend soi-même, de donner des images différentes et d'ouvrir la vue autre chose, à un avenir, à l'autre, ce qui n'est pas le cas d'une idéologie dogmatique. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question will be, is the real the one that he read you didn't understand, or is the real the translation you understand that I'm reading to you? Where does my work meet reality? Is poetry indifferent to this impulse? Poetry is the absolute real. The closer to poetry something is, the truer it is. These words by Novalis, which I placed as excerpt to my book, The Old Man of the Mountain, clearly showed the process of my poetry, defining me as a poet and giving poetry the job of unveiling the real. The poet is the one who will be attentive to the words, to the movement of the sentence, to the unveiling of things through language. The writing of poetry has a demand in relation to language as it wants to explore all its possibilities in the simple sonority of its resonances. It articulates language with the body of the one who writes so that the words may emerge in their accurateness and precision. Poetry remains a labor on oneself and on the real. It founds the latter, and that is why it is the real. The real is a multiplicity of languages. What a poem translates is the manner of apprehension of the real, often as a stutter. In terms of translation, the fragments permit to catch the real in its instantaneity. In fact, the real can only be perceived in instants, snapshots. It is those bits and pieces which the poet works and organizes so as to produce something that is not past reality, but the becoming real. The manner in which these fragments of the real are imbricated gives rise to another reality. That reality is never produced completely. Each time these fragments, for the one who will read them, can produce different realities because the words, depending on how they're accented in such or such a sequence of the sentences, will produce something else. It is only the reconstructed real that will be theorized. Poetry permits to take apart and exhibit the parts and gears of the construct. The work of writing poetry is totally a matter of deconstruction, reconstruction of the linguistic structure. It has to be there without, however, imposing itself on the text. A reconstruction which the classic novel demanded in the name of a fictive continuity. The real is never given in writing, but rather its discontinuity. Its perception is only fragmentary. Catching the real through the poem is a matter of confrontation, collage, montage, of a meeting of images or objects that were not meant to meet, that will animate the poem and make one reflect on what it is one sees in the real. It is not objective reality, but is assemblage due to the chance of the selection. The real can be read in 1,001 ways. Therefore, the poet is careful to register all the facts he sees. His eyes will register them, his mind will question them differently. The clashes that come from this will produce illuminations. My writing, because it interrogates the real, consigns dogmatism to nothingness. To dare enter the myth in order to break it if it is petrified, or reorient it if it's still alive. Religious fundamentalism does not admit of such a procedure. Fundamentalism resides in the affirmation of the truth. Its vision is unshakable. Now, any and all visions are there to be shaken up. The writing of poetry is perception of the real in movement. It is exactly that calm instability. Instability is not non-stability. It is, to the contrary, deeply anchored in movement. The poem never offers the truth, but opens possibilities. It never offers a totally framed, finished image, but threads allowing the re-evaluation of the image the poet perceives and wants to give to see in his own language. These threads permit, depending on the moment, depending on how one picks them up for oneself, to give different images and to open the view on something else, on a future, on an other. That is not the case in a dogmatic ideology.
Thank you, Pierre. I have to say that my staff and I were conspiring before this week to think, how could we get Pierre to be part of this panel? And through the genius of his translation, we have made him part of our panel. Before we open it up to questions, I just want to note a couple of events upcoming. This afternoon, the Shambaugh House reading will be live on Zoom today at 5 o'clock with Kimhana, Alexandra Kay, and Mei Yue. And Cinematheque on Sunday night at 6 o'clock in the Adler Journalism Building, room 101. Edwige Dro will host Ousmane Sembane's Theoroi's Camp. That's at 6 o'clock. And with that, I'll open it up to questions, comments, ideas. Natasha has, again, remember, please wait till John gets to you with the microphone so that the viewers at home can hear.
Yeah, so thank you.
It's not on.
It is on. Looks like it's not on, and it sounds like it's not on, but it is. There is reality for it. So thank you all for, as always, really wonderful papers. As Farah was listening, I was thinking, only Knausgaard had the wit to write his entire oeuvre of line breaks as poetry. It would have escaped all of the challenges that it has encountered.
Natasha, can you hold on?
You can repeat it. You can also repeat it.
Can you repeat the question? We're having a problem with the mic.
You're good now.
Now we can.
Okay, it was on, but it wasn't on. There we go. So I'll skip the Knausgaard remark because it's irrelevant. But so I want to say all four of you spoke to the question, the reality half of the assignment, but none of you really spoke to the hunger part. So I'm just going to leave it out there and say, well, no, I won't leave it out there, but I'm going to press a little bit harder and say, you know, in a way, the question was written to make you confront the fact that although all the things that you've said about reality are clearly, you know, come from both a profound experience and a strong personal take, none of you have really engaged direct head-on with the pressing problem of truth and reality as it is, I think, impacting fiction today. And I raised the question for poetry, because the question was raised for poetry as well, because documentary poetry is a trend that has to some extent affiliated itself with this pressure to for hunger for a kind of reality. One suspects that it may have to do with the presence of images in the culture, and that realism is triangulated through images. But in general, you know, do you feel that the pressure towards more real, more realistic, more of that recognizable is present somewhere in the environment in which you write? Thank you.
Who wants to take that on?
I think this means we failed, but
I mean, it appeals to your case more.
I mean, more real, more. I think the word authentic has become like the word.
You can take the mask off if you like.
I think the word authentic or real has kind of become like the word literal. How we use literal now. I think authentic is, I'm used to seeing it now more in terms of this is the vacation you'll go on and this is the meal you'll have, which is exactly like this thing you're not directly engaging with. For more real, more truth, I think we're surrounded with, or we're constantly immersed in this, like there's all these platforms around, again, this is why I failed at this, I think, but there's all this content coming our way which promises the real of your life, of your day, of what you're doing. I think we're constantly immersed in that, and we like that, and we want that. We have this voyeuristic need to see what's going on in other people's lives, whether they're a celebrity or whether they're a neighbor or whatever it is. So I think the work that we're seeing does reflect that, and it does reflect this idea that I don't know, that there is some authentic story to get at. I don't believe that that's the case, but you guys?
Well, we are living in the age of infotainment. I mean, facts, etc., becoming a kind of material to be consumed in large quantities and so on. And I see that, you know, poetry is a kind of antidote to this hunger for, you know, info, facts, etc. So, and poetic language itself is something that is outside and beyond this materialistic networks of, you know, exchange. So poetry, you know, poetic language doesn't, you know, I don't know, doesn't have this direct, you know, consequences or, yeah, so they are out of, I mean, it is out of this, you know, materialistic concerns and so on. But I'm sorry, I failed to answer a question in terms of hunger. I'm not hungry for facts. I mean, facts make me depressed. I mean, I don't know. I mean, poetry is a way of running away from facts, running away from Trump or Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, so we take refuge in literature, in poetry, in poetic language. Thank you.
Can I skip it? I don't know what your poetry is.
No, I objectively do not want to respond a hunger of reality, because I don't think there is a hunger of reality. If you see in the cinema, for example, it's not reality. And the society is constructed on a myth which is not reality. The politics, discourse, political discourse is not the reality. The facts we see in the news, it's not reality. And it's because that I want to say, because people say, yeah, poetry is only imagination. And it's not true. And it's because of that, I say, and now we have, for me, I speak because in Algeria and in Muslim worlds, we have this problem with the fundamentalism, with Islam, and with the vision, completely absurd. For me, it's absurd, but it is also mortal vision. Oui, mortal vision. And so this vision don't want poetry, because poetry is another way to look at the real. And the hunger is, for me, it's the hunger of poetry and not the hunger of the real. Because the real, what is real? It's a problem. It's a problem. You have, for example, I say, because in the 20s, with Dziga Vertov in cinema, Dziga Vertov, Kino Pravda. But Pravda is the title of the news of Lenin, La Pravda. And people thought it is the reality in the cinema. And it was not the reality in the cinema, but how the cinema can conduct people to be engaged in the revolution and something like this. And so when you speak about reality, I think it's always a problem. It's always a problem because we don't share the same reality. And poetry is the only way to maybe give us a possibility to investigate the real.
Point of translation there. Habib translated himself mortal reality. You said mortal, right? Reality or mortal. That was the wrong word, because mortal is something that can die. What he's really saying is lethal. That is what kills. That is that opposite little thing, which I think is an interesting little point. If I could add that I kind of disagree with the fact, or I agree with Habib's version. I have another version in terms of poetry and reality. I think it is the job of the poet to locate reality or new reality. I just gave a talk on Port Salan and doing another one in 2 hours. And that late Ceylon poetry, which talks of geology, where the world is those rocks and fast, is a way of getting to a rock base of the real, speaking in certain ways. And I think at this point, specifically, it is important to find vocabularies, to find areas that do coincide with the real. Indeed, it's not in TV or it's not in the news and so on. But poetry wants to address the real deeply, and it does not want to create imaginary things to lose oneself in. That's what entertainment is about, right? Poetry is something else.
Anyone want to say anything to that on the panel?
I don't know what's your poetry.
I think the way that I looked at it, and just from hearing everyone's talks, is how do you engage with this idea of what is real with your work? How do you take that on? How important is that to you? Not so much maybe considering that demand for more real stories. And I think that is a really interesting question. Does that demand exist? That do we want more of the real, and where does that come from? I think a lot of that would tie back to, if I just consider the pandemic and art and movies and literature that will come out of it. And I think we will flock to that, and we will want that because it makes sense of what we've been through and what we can't articulate, or this massive thing that happened which was experienced so differently. And I think for years to come, we're going to be seeing stuff about it. I would imagine that demand would exist for the real in that way. But I don't think, and in my work, I don't think I engage with this idea of one reality or one truth or one authentic version of something. I don't think it's as objective as that.
Sanam, I was hoping you might say a little bit more about your thoughts on erasure as relating to both the story you tried to tell about your mother and about the social media star. We seem to be living in a period of erasure, right? It occurred to me when Fahri brought truthiness to the table that yesterday the Trump organization announced the establishment of a new social platform called Truth. And I thought, my God, after recording something like 30,000 lies, now a whole social media platform designed perhaps to upend our ideas of truth or to erase them. Maybe you could say another word about that, the role of erasure in the writer's life.
I think we are constantly engaging with that, and we make decisions about that when we write, when we edit. Something I was really struck by is when you do these events and you start with, I don't know what it's called over here, but like an acknowledgement of who this,
Land acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I was in Australia just like when the pandemic hit, and it was my first time going to events over there. And every event started with welcome to country, what's called welcome to country. And again, it's an acknowledgement that for years and years and years, we erased the names of the people who lived here, their stories, all they knew about this place. So I think we're considering erasure on a level that we haven't ever before when it comes to national histories as well. When it comes to, okay, what is this nostalgic idea of a country? What was this country built on? What are our ideas? What we're teaching in schools? I think it's a really, really interesting time right now to be considering what are the stories that have been left out? And even when certain stories have been told, who have they been told by? Who has been sort of directing or managing the project of telling those stories? There's this massive sort of overhaul. And during COVID as well, there was, when you look at publishing houses as well, who is in charge of what stories get told? What actually gets money put behind it? How are things being edited? How are things being marketed? I mean, from start to finish, we're considering what has been erased, what shouldn't have been, and who are the right people to tell a story, because there's certainly not one person. So I don't know if that answers your...
Brilliantly, yes. John?
Hi, thank you for the panel. I have a more general question. I'm interested in this process of when you're writing, when you create your poetry or other writing. When you are writing about the reality or truth, do you actually jump out of yourself afterwards to look back as if you are one of the readers? And do you actually allow the different interpretation or different versions of reality or truth? Do you intentionally do that, or do you actually want to sort of create some reality or truth you are more intent to present? That's one general question. I don't know whether I expressed that clearly. It's about your process of writing. The other comment I want to make is where you are explaining how you create your truth or reality. I was cannot forget the Squid Games right now. It's very popular on Netflix, and there's so many explanations and comments. That is a sort of a different point when you present this reality. People feel they see more truths and realities from this completely fictional series, right? How do you comment on that? Thank you.
I'll try to answer the first question. I tried my hand at writing haikus. And while I was writing haikus, which is, a form, not basically Turkish, it's Japanese, whatever.
Japanese.
Yeah. And so I could not see myself as a person in that form. So my own experiences did not play such a huge role at all. I was outside the building, I was looking inside. There were, character situations, and I was peeping into it. All right? But when I am writing my own, let's say, poems, I can see myself better as a person experiencing, living, and so on and so on. So I think if someone attempted to write in a form, that is not available in their own culture, and I think that would probably the thing they would experience, just like I did. So I don't know whether that helps clarify your question.
I would love to riff on. Can I riff off that?
Okay, sure.
When I started writing in English, my fourth language, I didn't have much, so I looked for short forms to find, right? And so I came across haiku. And so my first poems were all in haiku. And the one that will open my final thing, I'll give it to you quick. Autumn leaves on clear rocks in a double scotch. So it was moving the form into somewhat completely else. But the interesting thing I did years later with haiku, I was in Algeria when we were teaching together, and I was trying to translate Tarafa, the great pre-Islamic poet, his ode. And I had a friend who knew it by heart and worked with me. And there was no way I could get that form that is very flowery, very long, very, very long. And it sounds bad in English because it sounds like bad flowery poetry. So I cut out the adjectives, and strangely enough, I came to a linked haiku form in English as the best way of bringing the imagery that Tarafa had in the poems over, so that they became a long ranga. So, the form transformed in Muslim language into something else again, which has its own reality, which of course, is something else. Yeah. But so one can use forms or plays of that order. It's all done with mirrors.
While I was writing, in fact, I cheated. Because I listened to some, songs on the Spotify, and I looked at the titles and so on. They had English titles, and the music, and I was kind of inspired or supported or by those musical compositions. So I did not decide. Okay, I'm going to write haiku. So out of the blue. It didn't come out of the blue. I used music as a kind of lever to to inspire me. Yeah.
Have any of you seen Squid Game?
No.
Okay, so we're all apparently avoiding Squid Game. I'm really sorry. The second part of the question was to do with that. I am avoiding it. Like, I cannot get sucked in. So, sorry.
Hello, thank you everyone. So my question is this. There was a big discussion last year in Europe regarding the book that got the Booker Prize, The Discomfort of the Evening. It's from a Norwegian writer who defines themselves as non-binary. So when the book started being translated, there was a debate about whether the translators should be non-binary as well, because they have this experience themselves, or they should be translated by anyone as usual. We had such a case in Greece as well, with the translation of Ocean Vuong's poems and novel. It was translated by a woman, a white cis woman, and a huge debate occurred about whether it should have been translated by, for example, a gay man or a gay Asian man speaking Greek. So I'm still wondering whether, actually my question is, who do you think, no, sorry, give me a minute. Well, many questions there. Who owns the story? And nowadays that everyone can speak up and write, and which was not something that used to happen before, do you believe that we should leave the stories to the people who have actually experienced them and write only for what we know? I'm talking as a white cis woman. Should we respect this, or should we keep writing even stories about people and experiences we have no idea of, but maybe we can empathize or imagine? Is it clear? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll try to answer the translation bit of the question. I mean, so your question, involves this idea of the translator having the same sexual orientation and so on, right? I mean, okay, I have been translating Walt Whitman, who was gay. I'm not. I've been translating Emily Dickinson. She was a lesbian, supposedly, whatever. So, and luckily they are dead poets, right? So maybe they would not allow me to translate. Whitman was a teetotaler. I'm not. So, I mean, if I were translating a modern poet, I don't know. I mean, they are, I find them rather restricting that the translator should have the same sexual orientation, whatever. I think what the author should focus on is how his or her text has been rendered into the, target language.
Well, I think everyone is free to write about what he wants. For example, I write about Odysseus, about the Greek. Before I was in Greece, I wrote about the Tatar, the Mongol. I never was there, but it was in my childhood. I saw Hollywood films, and they impressed me. And so you can write, I think, just what you feel. And for me, for example, Ulysses, Odysseus, the going to Ithaca, it was the return for the Algerian who were migrant, for the migrant, and always dreaming about the country, the patria, the patria, and yeah, and it's just a metaphor. You can, you can take many subjects as metaphor for what you have to say and what you feel, things you feel. So for me, it's a false problem, you have to be black to translate a black novel. You have to be transgenre to translate. C'est transgenre? Trans, yeah. To translate. It is, I think, interest, you know, because people have interest to be in their community and to, it's only business for me. It's not a question of production of art or, no, it's only business and only politics also. So for me, well, you write what you feel and what you have to say in the way you have to say it. So
I would go further and say that translation is othering. It's making other. So if you permit the notion of translation, you can't link it down to it. It can only be translated as what it already is, right? So that makes it completely. And who are you as a writer who are writing, even if you don't write about anybody else, even about yourself? How can you do that? Who gives you permission to say something about, how do you know that you know something about yourself? But, you know, it just is not there. I think it's, in that sense, a false problem, you know. And the whole idea of writing, of doing that, is an othering. It's, you know, and translation does all of that. So I think it's a false problem.
I actually, I have a slightly different take on this. I think I'm, in my field, we're constantly, there's this argument over should you write what you know? Should you stick with stories that speak to your experiences, because how you cover them, how you write about them as a reporter is heavily influenced by your own background, by what you know. I think for me, the most important thing is write what you know is a bit limiting, but the thing I take is really important is, do you have a curiosity and are you willing to learn? With most of the stories that I've covered, it starts with just a curiosity, like I want to know more about whatever the thing is, or I don't know how something works, or I want to know the story behind something. But then what it takes is a lot of research and a lot of understanding and acknowledging how I'm coming to the story and being willing to completely start from a blank page, not asserting that I know more than you or someone else or someone who's experiencing it. With the next book that I am hopefully working on, there's a lot of it is to do with the experience of sex and desire and intimacy. And when I started to look at the queer experience of it, no matter how much I tried to get into it, I realized that there is a limitation for me. I cannot. And if I try and write about it, it's only going to fail. So I pull back from that and I say, okay, I don't need to tell the whole story of something. That's not my job. My job is to tell you certain parts of it that I understand, that I'm able to, and that I can find out about. Not to promise you. I think this is a mistake that a lot of, this is what irritates me with journalists that parachute into Pakistan. They're there to tell you the Pakistan story, the Afghanistan story. You can't do that, and it is wrong to do that, to promise that. So I can't say much about translation, but in terms of who gets to tell a story, I think it's not so much who you are, but are you willing to set that aside in order to tell your story? That's important to me.
In South Korea, the subject is kind of controversial. And nowadays, in the literary market in South Korea, the homosexual stories are quite popular, more and more. So, and there is a couple of gay writers in recent days, and for sure they handle homosexual stories. However, other heterosexual writers also wrote down these kinds of stories because and many readers choose these kinds of books just only they're curious for it. And some of the heterosexual writers claimed that only homosexual could be handle the homosexual stories. If so, if someone who wants to handicap person stories, the writers also to handicap that. So I know what they want. However, I don't think it's a good way just to handle writing down the homosexual stories only for the curious eye. And the American writer Michael Cunningham, who wrote the novel The Hours, yeah, even though he is gay, but he doesn't want to call him gay writer because he, although the protagonists on his work, most of them, the characters are homosexual. However, the intention of his work is the protagonist only wants to their own life. They want to live their own life, and they want to find the truth of themselves. So if someone, although he is a heterosexual, even though he wants to write homosexual stories, at least I think they should try to find out the truthfulness.
Thank you. Any further comments from our panelists? Wonderful. That seems like a great note to end on. So thank you very much. Please help me again to thank our panel this afternoon. So we have a number of book festival events still to come. As I mentioned, there are programs here in the room, and for those watching online, you can find more at iowicitybookfestival.org. I know the International Writing Program has plenty of other programs as well. That's iwp.uiowa.edu. So thank you very much for coming, and have a pleasant rest of your afternoon.